Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone from all around the world. Welcome to the CKS online webinar. Please be informed that in addition to the live stream in Zoom, we also have our webinar streaming on the Facebook page of the Center for Khmer Study, and the video will be recorded, which will be made available later in our website and our YouTube channel. My name is Sun Pun Lu. Today, I'm a moderator at the Center for Khmer Study. I'm the program manager. And welcome to the Center for Khmer Study. To those who haven't known about the Center for Khmer Study, we are a non-profit and non-governmental organization. We work to promote research and education sector in Cambodia and in the Mekong region, focusing on social science, humanity, and art. We have two offices. Our main office is in Siem Reap province, and our second office is in Phnom Penh capital city. Let me introduce you to the topic of today's webinar entitled Body of Research and Researcher Body, Methodological and Ethical Trouble from Cambodia. We have our speaker today. Our speaker is Dr. Thara Tran. May we see your name, please, doctor? See your face, please, doctor. Okay, Dr. Thara is a historian of Europe and Southeast Asia. She crafts and curates knowledge and learning projects following the colonial and feminist practice. Her research interest is hospitality in the context of humanitarianism and development, migration, environmental care, and food waste. Her current book project is entitled Hospitality in Danger, Women's Body and Humanitarianism in Colonial Cambodia. She completed her doctoral degree at Johns Hopkins University and at present is an adjunct professor at the University of New York and the Council on International Education Exchange in Prague. She also hosts SALA, a community roundtable on unlearning history. Again, her topic is for today's webinar is Body of Research and Researcher Body, Methodological and Ethical Trouble from Cambodia. Please allow me to read her abstract for a moment. Who talk about the intercourse between a body of research and a researcher body? In the middle of my fellowship, I woke up to troubling pain. A dice in my spine shocked a nerve and signal electrify my brain. Later that week, I woke up from discectomy. Whatever the surgeon extract looked like overly ripe coconut, fish flesh in milky brine. My sleep days was an occupational hazard. I was a historian bent over in research and writing alongside women's work, pregnancy, childbirth, and childcare. I read the specimen as my academic labor, incarnate, an embodiment of story on colonial power and violence, called from the field and archival work on hospitality and women's body in Cambodia during the period of the French protectorate. My sensation of contemporary pain began to shape my query of historical pain. And so the colonial and feminist proposal that I trouble the field of Cambodia study and Southeast Asia study with is this. We must interrogate the positionality between the body in our research and our researcher body, the penetration of historical knowledge on the dead and living, and the methodological and ethical trouble that possess us when the life of others touch us personally. Very interesting. I will give the floor now to Dr. Thara to do your presentation to the audience. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Son. Hello, all. I'm going to share my screen real quick and get this set up. Are we good? Yep. Okay, great, thanks. Hello all. So before taking over and monologuing into this space, I'd like to take a moment just to say thank you to the Center for Khmer Studies for their support, not only for my work as a researcher, but also just for the work that they do in Cambodia. I remember being a college student studying abroad back in 2008 and taking a class at their at Wat Dam Naik in Siem Reap with CKS. And over the years, I've always been grateful to this institution and its generosity. So thank you to all the staff there. Lastly, I also need to acknowledge two other groups. First, the staff at the National Archives of Cambodia in Phnom Penh, and it's their stewardship really that allows me and many others in Cambodia and afar to do historical work on the subject that is the first half of my talk today. And the second group that I also need to acknowledge is Teresa DeLanges, Cindy Nguyen, and Nicole Yeo-Wei. It is our feminist kinship over the last year that is really the source for what is the second half of my talk today, that which Sun hinted to in the abstract. So first, an introduction again to myself. My name is Tara Tran, and I'm a historian. And traditionally, historians identify as experts of a time and a place. And if I had to follow this institutional practice, I might introduce myself as a historian of 19th and 20th century Southeast Asia and its intersections, particularly with Europe. But putting myself into this box doesn't always feel right. And really what feels right for me is to identify as a decolonial and feminist historian who integrates transdisciplinary study on a global scale to experiment with deconstructing hospitality as a way for us in the present to work through the legacies of empire. Now, my context for this work, for this very broad, abstract philosophical text that I put in front of you, is Southeast Asia. And most often I go to Cambodia and Vietnam, the lands of my parentage, to work through these ideas. And it's in this space where I ask these questions about hospitality, particularly in the context of humanitarianism, development, migration, environmental care, and foodways. And it's questions about hospitality in these contexts that often open into what I found have been histories of violence. And my talk today is very much so a history of violence. The first part, as I alluded to, body of research, focuses on histories of violences as experienced by women's bodies in French colonial Cambodia. The second part, I pivot to researcher's body, where I focus on what the research has done to my own body. So I'll share that first part with you here, body of research. Now, what is my body of research? Its shape at present is most defined by my current book project, which was briefly described at the beginning. The book looks at Cambodia from the 1880s to the 1930s and maps three vectors of a story. First, how colonial humanitarian discussions in Cambodia were connected to wider global discussions about women, gender, and sexuality. Second, how colonial humanitarianism relied on racist, patriarchal, and elitist assumptions about Indigenous women. And third, how colonial humanitarianism was not simply a binary and unidirectional encounter between active benefactor and passive beneficiary, but rather, women, for example, rendered their own cultures of colonial humanitarianism through what I see was their reception, but also their rejection and reinvention of aid. Now, this project has been a sustained deliberation of women's bodies as hospitality engendered, specifically after I left a place that was outside of Cambodia, that is South Sudan, and then returned to the archive, specifically in Cambodia. There, the historically gendered nature of humanitarianism in Cambodia became evident through four issues: slavery, prostitution, rape, childbirth, sorry, that's five issues actually, and widowhood, each bodied and embodied by Indigenous women. In each chapter, I sift through the sentiments and reasons of colonial humanitarianism's responses to each domain in order to empirically parse the paradoxical acts of hospitality as they unfolded into and out of Indigenous women's bodies in French colonial Cambodia. And I'd like to go through, map out those chapters for you this moment. In chapter 1, Danseuse, Affairs of Bondage, Networks, and Jurisdiction, sorts through the moves of a scandal about sex and politics that unfolded in the summer of 1898. The affair opens onto larger discussions about human bondage in Cambodia and French attempts to abolish it. Slavery seems a natural departure point for historical and historiographical reasons, because remember, from the protectorate start in French colonial Cambodia, as well as in other European colonies, administrators explicitly announced that their goal was to abolish slavery. What they saw was a humanitarian depravity. So in effect, abolition became a gateway to other social interventions for them. So as historians of humanitarianism have shown, the abolitionist movement, beginning in the late 18th century, linked Euro-American imperial goals with humanitarian reforms. And what chapter 1 does is it centers around the case of a young enslaved woman, someone who was in a contract of debt bondage, and it sets the scene for the later revolution of colonial humanitarian culture in Cambodia. Some of you or some of those in Phnom Penh might have remembered that I did run a session on this particular affair, and then also shared it with some high school students at the Lycée Descartes in Phnom Penh. So they learned that during this late 19th century moment, French abolitionist sentiment and law reconfigured Cambodian networks of power and subsequently cleared a space for future humanitarian designs of French administrators and indigenous actors. In the screen back here is an image of this letter that this young enslaved woman had sent to a French administrator in summer of 1898, written in French, but had been completed by a scribe that she had somehow procured in the city. On to chapter 2. What to do about, lost my place. Women's bodies continued to grate at the missions of men when it came to prostitution, the subject of chapter 2. At the turn of the 20th century, in Cambodia across the world, the discourse on prostitution rehearsed heated claims drawn from earlier and ongoing discussions on slavery. So again, there are thematic relationships between 1 and 2, between slavery and prostitution. After all, many of those said, prostitution and the alleged, in the French, they called it la traite des blanches, or the white traffic, white slavery, were interchangeable words in 19th century white Francophone and Anglophone feminists. And in this chapter, which I title Filles, Mapping Prostitution and Regulation in Phnom Penh, what we see is that the Cambodian capital triggered racist and sexist institutions of care and control over indigenous women's sexuality, especially over how they moved about the city. This chapter takes off from about 1885, when mass anti-French uprisings swept Cambodia and triggered a deployment of colonial troops to Phnom Penh. It was because of this rebellion that there was a huge spike in the population in the city, and the French, who were afraid of a repeat of militarized anti-colonialism that had happened with the 1885 rebellions, moved to consolidate colonial power, the power that chapter 1 also explores. Now, subsequently, Phnom Penh, again, as I said, began to grow as a space and population, but also because of that, there were needs for urban development. So what happened is that this began to also draw in female migrant workers into the city from provinces, but also beyond Cambodia from places, for example, Vietnam. And what we find is that notably these rural Vietnamese, Khmer, and Chinese women enter the sex industry in Phnom Penh. And while the imagined identity of Phnom Penh's filles as, quote, fallen women, stirred leftist humanitarian sympathies about poor people, the regime that ultimately governed was that of what was called regulation, which viewed prostitutes as vectors of disease to be controlled by the state. So while those who were against regulation critiqued it as an inhumane system, regulationists maintained that this policy was actually a humanitarian policy because it was protecting prostitutes and, importantly, Phnom Penh's respectable men and families from sexually transmitted diseases such as, for example, syphilis and gonorrhea. It also had this association with crime and filth. So by looking for the itineraries of these women throughout the streets of Phnom Penh using these maps, seeing how they moved through neighborhoods, how they occupied buildings, how they walked around street corners, what this chapter does is chart how hospitality is in contestation with Indigenous women's movement. Moving on from there to chapter 3, I move on to a different set of sources, and most of those are text-based sources written in French. I call these chronicles of rape because they were often narratives of sexual violence against women. And what to do about sexual violence, specifically rape, in Cambodia was another formative site for gendered regimes of humanitarian culture. The history of penal justice in cases of male sexual violence against women and girls involves traversing the divide between the urban environs of Phnom Penh as well as its rural provinces in the fields and forests specifically. Images of fields and forests are curiously a very dominant image in these discourses. And this is the setting of chapter 3, Violet, which is a historical but also literary reading of stories that colonial and indigenous people told about the rape of women and girls. Again, we see efforts on the part of the French to address what they identified as yet another crisis in the protectorate. So they already identified slavery, they identified prostitution. The next one that they're targeting is sexual violence against women. And they connect that to what they see was a tyranny of Cambodian law, of Cambodian judges who were not able to properly regulate and adjudicate these crimes. So what the French authorities do is they reorganize the judiciary system in Cambodia, and they promulgate certain codes, particularly the 1924 Penal Code. This was a legal regime that identified and punished crimes of sexual violence. Elsewhere, beyond these legal codes, there was an explicit chronicling of rape, that is, storytelling of rape, particularly in court summaries, police registers, medical findings, and newspaper reporting, many of these sources located in the National Archives of Cambodia. And it proves that accounts of violated female sexuality were not just a private interest or a private secret to be kept, under the table, but it was actually a public interest. The state had a vested interest in it. And what these chronicles indicate is that colonial authors, whether they were public servants or whether they were private journalists writing columns in the newspapers, they assumed that raped women could only be saved by a, quote, modern sense of justice. That modern sense of justice being French laws and codes, right? Not indigenous former Cambodian codes or sense of customs. Now, this chapter discloses how the French protectorate touted its penal regime as the only possible way to expose, punish, and thwart sexual violence because they could see no other local option. Moving on from there to chapter 4, to another domain of intervention by the colonial state. Now, humanitarian culture, I found, were its most, quote, feminine silhouette in an act of hospitality that was engendered particularly in the area of maternal and infant protection. Now, the Project of Empire, as many other scholars have already found, was for the most part, as described, a masculine endeavor. However, including in a place like Cambodia. However, there are some accountings that show that it was also a feminine endeavor, particularly when you look at the roles that white French women or white European women were playing during this colonial era. They weren't just domestic housewives. They also found that they had these public social responsibilities. And where were they? They were in the area of maternal and infant protection. That's where they took their work. That's where they took their public responsibilities. And they were concerned with Cambodia's virility and fertility for some reasons. What chapter 4 does is it breaks down the operation of a humanitarian organ that French middle-class women transplanted and nurtured. And I look at this specifically through one organization. It was a private charity called the Society for Maternal and Infant Protection, whose former headquarters are actually located just above Wat Phnom, which had historically been the European quarters. So this organization, this private charity, was established in 1906. And it evolved into a prominent institutional organ of colonial humanitarian culture, concerned with Indigenous women's maternal health, as well as infant care. The French women partnered with colonial health services, mostly headed by white French men, to combat Cambodia's, what they perceived as a problem, which was Cambodia's infant mortality rate. It was high, they said, according to their statistics. And related to that high infant mortality rate, another problem they saw was Cambodia's depopulation. It wasn't producing at high as an amount, for example, compared to Vietnam, neighboring Vietnam. So what they found is that these experts identifies the cause of these problems to be the suffering of women, specifically Khmer women. They singled out ethnic Khmer women as the problem because they found that they had higher infant mortality rates and higher maternal mortality rates, according to their research. So what they did, these philanthropists and civil servants, was they latched onto the cause of protecting mothers and infants, even if Khmer women express hesitance or resistance to their charity. Now, the last chapter, which is one that I had done new research for during the course of this last year of fellowship, is on widows. I was curious because I saw many of these applications that widows were submitting to the colonial state, asking or requesting for their pensions on behalf of their former or their deceased husbands who had worked for the civil state. And what this chapter aims to do is examine how the colonial state offered social assistance to these widows of Indigenous male servants and how these widows made claims on that assistance. I find it very interesting and fascinating to look into how these women were proactively using the colonial state to get these forms of, say, colonial modern forms of social assistance. It is a colonial social welfare state, and they're playing into that system. And interestingly, there are also another set of sources that seem to indicate that the state, while it had very strict regulations against the sale and consumption of opium, were allowing some exceptions for certain widows to sell them. So they would give them licenses to sell that opium because they saw that as a means for them to produce some sort of income in their state, in their vulnerability state because of their marital status. So what is the conclusion of this project? What I'm trying to do here, or at least what I think that I found, is somewhat of a paradoxical history for what I call is a praxis of resilience. Now, this is an attempt to propose that these Indigenous women who had been the targets of these colonial interventions didn't suffer at all, and that they were fighting back, and that they had all the agents that they had. I offer this argument cautiously so as not to suggest that they did not experience suffering or abuse, but as a way to really nuance what is often this binary framework in a lot of colonial histories, that binary framework being colonizers came in, they invaded, they exploited, they hurt everyone, and then all the colonized subjects were victims of that. They were passive, they received it, they obeyed, and they suffered. That isn't to say that that narrative wasn't true in some cases, but what I'm trying to do with this project here is to really nuance that and show how these colonial subjects, specifically in the case of this project, Indigenous women and their families throughout Cambodia, had somewhat clever but practical ways to responding to these colonial humanitarian interventions, in the sense that they would, on their own terms, if they had the choice and if they had the opportunity, either receive that aid, reject it, or reinvent it in some ways. And there are some examples of how they do that scattered throughout these chapters. I'm going to begin to pivot a bit more to the second part of this talk, where I get a little bit more reflective about my positionality. But before I do that, I just want to say that to offer this explanation now, over the years, and notably over the last year during my fellowship with CKS and working on hospitality and gendered, that is, doing historical research about power and violence, has become a big problem for me, I have to be honest. It hasn't been easy, and I haven't fully embraced it every step of the way. And there are times when I just feel a bit like maybe disgusted is too strong a word, but a bit disgusted by it. But it's become a big methodological and ethical problem for me. And the problem has been, what is the point of telling these stories? And in telling these stories, am I inflicting harm to the people in these stories and inflicting harm on myself? The historian Sadia Hartman put it this way several years before I ever even started to think about it. She said, "What do stories afford anyway? A way of living in the world in the aftermath of catastrophe and devastation? A home in the world for the mutilated and violated self? For whom? For us or for them? In other words, why are we doing this work?" I'll talk a little bit more about Hartman's work later. But to this end, my concern over the last year has been not only the content of my research, that is the body of research, but also why do I do it and whether I should even be doing it. And I have a few vignettes to share with you to illustrate key moments of how I've fought with this problem from field and archival work around Cambodia. And now on to the researcher's body. Excuse me, I'm getting over a virus here, so. On January 1st, 2024, I woke up to troubling pain from my apartment in Phnom Penh. As I groaned and wept under the shower head, my toddler, aware that something was awry but play never dies, seized the toilet gun and lathered the room with her New Year water and laughter. A disc in my spine had choked on a nerve and signals electrified my brain. Later that week, I woke up from a discectomy in Bangkok. Whatever the surgeon extracted was left for me in a jar, and when I looked inside, it looked like the overly ripe contents of a coconut, white flesh in its milky brine. It turned out that my slipped disc was perhaps an occupational hazard, a vocational pain. Me, the historian, bent over in research and writing, alongside pregnancy, childbirth, and childcare. Now, when I looked at that jar, I remember right after my surgery, like sitting in bed looking at it, I started to read it. I read it as what was the spirit of my academic labor inside this jar, incarnate in physical form, a presentist embodiment of stories on colonial violence, culled from my field and archival work on hospitality and women's bodies in Cambodia and across the global South. In that moment, I was thinking, and in this past year, reflecting how the Academy idolizes the productive, objective, and independent mind, where beyond our dedications and acknowledgements, though, in all of our books and publications, is the critical discourse on the power and violence that a life of the mind, a so-called life of the mind, exerts on the body. There are the classics who theorize state power in Southeast Asia, such as Geertz, Anderson, and Scott. And we have those who uncovered the intimate domains of power, for example, by Anne-Laura Stoller or Barbara Andaya. Now, as a researcher and educator who examines the history of women's bodies in colonial spaces, I have benefited from these labors. But who talks about the intercourse between a body of research and a researcher's body? What of the after effects of knowledge penetration on the dead and living? Where is the warning about methodological and ethical problems that, as my fellow colleague and kin speak of, possess you when the violence of others touches you? Now, the feminist proposal that I trouble Cambodian and Southeast Asian studies with is this. We must interrogate the explicit positionality between the bodies in our research and also our researcher's body. What is the relationship that we have with our own research? It's not as objective and distant for some, particularly when you're working on histories of violence. This means asking, who are my research subjects to me and who am I to them? What effect do they have on me? And what effect do I have on them, even if they are dead and cannot speak? Over the last couple of years, I've meditated on these questions with exceptional joy and grief with some of my colleagues. The surgery turned this delicate set of questions into a declarative, quote, pedagogy of unwellness, which is what Mimi Cook talks about in Dear Elia. Now, in this season of winter rot and spring growth, what nursed me through physical, intellectual, and emotional pain has been kinship with other thinkers. In my own methodological and ethical troubles, I've often looked to Saidiya Hartman's feminist practice, which exposes the duress of doing research on violence against women and proposes manners of redress for not only our subjects, but ourselves. Now, I need to pause and acknowledge Saidiya Hartman for a moment. Now, more than 10 years after I did this field work on genocide memorials, after I did archival work on my current project, I came across Hartman just in the last couple of years. Now, Hartman is part of a generation of Black feminist scholars who've danced with questions about methodological and ethical problems of their own work, specifically on histories of Black women. In their work, I've found both wisdom and relief. Hartman's groundbreaking essay, Venus in Two Acts, has been particularly critical, containing words that have allowed me to think through and cry through my problems as a researcher in and on Cambodia. Throughout this part of the talk, I want to read parts of that essay to you today to show how Black feminist epistemology has guided me through methodological and ethical problems in my research, but also suggest how others in Cambodia and Southeast Asian studies might also benefit from these ancestors. Hartman's teachings have been my companion as I returned with ginger grit to my labor in recovering the voices of Asian women's bodies and that of my own. As I reflected on the troubles of doing research, while also tending to my own unwellness, my memory summoned a series of vignettes from before the surgery, when the position of my body in relation to my research shaped the contours of my work on hospitality. I'd like to share a couple of those, 3 of the vignettes with you. On the coast of Cambodia, there's a place called 𝐀𝐽, which many of you may be familiar with. Famous for its pepper, crab, but also its modernist villas. That is, what remains of these minimalist edifices, if they're still there. The skeletons of cement calcified into humid mangrove and jungle are specimens of a history of empire. At the start of the 1900s, the French, who claimed Cambodia as their colonial possession, established 𝐀𝐽 as a vacation town. In 1954, Cambodia became independent from France, and then the 50s and 60s turned into that golden age we are familiar of, a golden age for Cambodian art, culture, and design. Now, today, most of 𝐀𝐽's villas are abandoned, left to contend with the forest, where there are other memories to contend with. For example, if you take a road clinging 𝐀𝐽's shoreline inland, you'll enter the grounds of a Buddhist temple. And in a clearing beyond that temple, there's another minimalist edifice. Not a modernist villa, but a modern memorial to a genocide. No. That golden age in Cambodia faded away in 1970 with the start of the Civil War, and then the Khmer Rouge regime entered. Since that period of time, particularly during the 1980s, several genocide memorials sprung up across the country, including this one in 𝐀𝐽. And often when I came across them during my research, and this was over 10 years ago before I started on hospitality and gender, but often when I came across them, I, the stranger, was just let in without much interrogation, without needing much permission. And I found this, let's call it a welcoming. I found this welcoming to be a precarious threshold, a liminal threshold. And one of those thresholds was this memorial in 𝐀𝐽, which is in this photograph. Someone, I had wandered onto the property looking for it because I had heard that there was a memorial there, asked about it, and the caretaker there unlocked the chamber, gestured me in, and I stood there. This is me taking the photograph from standing inside the memorial. I stood there flanked by orderly stacks of skulls on my left and limbs on my right, my own body becoming a part of the space. Something about this crossing felt generous, but also extractive, an act of care, yet also a creepy act of violence. And this is my earliest memory of asking, as Hartman did, to what end does one open the casket and look into the face of death? She also says, how can narrative, that is our research, for example, how can narrative embody life in words and at the same time respect what we cannot know? How can we know? How does one listen for the groans and cries, the undecipherable songs, the crackle of fire in the cane fields, the laments for the dead, and the shouts of victory, and then just assign words to all of it that easily? As I sit with Hartman, I ask, am I guilty of occupying someone else's house, looting their remains? Am I transforming the gift of my research subjects into an act of violence, committing the Derridian slip of perversion when hospitality can suddenly become hostility? That research on Cambodian genocide memorials led me to my present work on hospitality, which I frame as a border crossing in the name of doing good. And I carried what was a bit of that nausea from the genocide memorials across the threshold into another space, that of the archives of Cambodia's past before the genocide, to the period of the French protectorate, taking me to what is predominantly my current work. Now, in those archives, I filled my airways, literally, with past and present particles. It was the dust, morning till afternoon, 5 days a week, also accompanied by the mosquitoes under the table. And while I was doing that, my nausea returned to my mind and my body as I was going through what were the intimate articles of people whose consent I would never have, the subjects in each of those chapters, an enslaved woman who claimed that the prime minister raped her, sex workers in urban Phnom Penh, women and girl survivors of sexual violence, pregnant and postpartum patients, widowed women. These were the people whose bodies would animate my storytelling. And this practice was causing me some anxiety because my stated profession is to supposedly construct a, quote, as Hartman said, a display of the violated body. But how could I, as Hartman asked, how could I do more than just recount the violence that deposited these traces in the archive? How could I work without committing further violence in my own act of narration? As Hartman wrote, was the archive, or really any place where we do our field or archival work, where we get our sources, was the archive indeed just a death sentence, a tomb, a display of the violated body, an inventory of property, a medical treatise on gonorrhea, a few lines about a whore's life, an asterisk in the grand narrative of history? Could those lives, could those real people's experiences be reduced to these stories, to these words that we write and tell? Yeah. Despite the nerves from the memorials and then to the archives, I just kept working, incentivized by productivity and being a good student and being a good researcher. Ashamedly so, I think that more than a sense of justice. After that season of research between Cambodia and France, I worked for an international development organization in South Sudan. My job was to design a health and hygiene curriculum. I trained local staff who were ethnic Dinka women who taught other Dinka women in remote rural villages about subjects from exclusive breastfeeding and child nutrition to hand washing and food safety. A few months into that routine, I became troubled again by the unstated assumption to what was our theory of change. That was, people's lives will improve if we invest in women. AKA, it is good to help women, not simply for the sake of women, but for the sake of others. Now, our interventions, which were instructions basically on care work, relied on female household heads and members to reproduce the aid that we gave. That said, I observed also how Dinka women reappropriated those interventions. And one example of this was with the jerry can in this photograph here, the plastic storage container. Now, in hygiene sessions, we promoted simple hand washing stations, engineered from sticks, a piece of string that you see hanging there, and this jerry can. And at one point, we found that people were dismantling the stations, taking them apart, so that they could use the jerry can for other functions like collecting water from rivers and wells. Makes sense, right? But we had goals or outcomes and outputs to fulfill, right? So we ordered field officers to punch small holes in the sides of the jerry cans so that the water couldn't be filled all the way up to store water, so that the can couldn't be filled up all the way to fill water. They could only hold enough, not that much, so that it could be used as hand washing. Now, of course, this didn't solve the problem of animals eating the soap bars. That was just a totally separate issue. What I learned from the jerry can destruction episode was how much our intervention, hygiene, among others, depended on the labor of women's bodies. To practice, not only to practice, but also to reproduce and propagate that knowledge and the material resources that we distributed. And so when I took a step back, I found I was thinking, okay, in troubling ways, somewhat antithetical to a feminist spirit, this method was just increasing the burden of responsibilities that women already had. Humanitarianism, in a sense, instrumentalized feminine labors, as illustrated in the appropriation of the jerry can. However, feminine labors were also instrumentalizing humanitarianism. That is, to play on the prefixes in the word hospitality, bodies are both hostage and host to power. Now, I carried my memories of Dinka women's labors out of South Sudan and back into the archive, where they made camp in my mind. And women's bodies were just constantly on my mind, so much so that they started to appear in my dreams. At the National Archives in Cambodia, back to Phnom Penh. So I've left South Sudan, come back to the archives. There's a collection of French language newspaper clippings from the 1930s. I noticed a set of clippings of court cases on sexual violence against women, specifically rape. One account, which multiple newspapers published, told of 3 Cambodian men who gang raped a Vietnamese woman. Another narrated how a young girl was raped by her blind older brother, who was a Buddhist monk. I also came across several medical reports by French physicians who conducted pelvic exams for female survivors of sexual violence. And suddenly my eyeballs, my optic nerves, were constantly filtering for terms like rape, rapist, raped, and mostly in French. And all of this graphic language about female genitalia. And then I started to have nightmares. I became afraid of going to sleep because I was afraid of what I would encounter in the dream world. Suddenly, historical violence bred a present fear in me of giving my body over to the dream world. As for Hartman, the reading and writing of this history had, as she wrote, engendered me. The knowledge of the other marked me and became, I appreciate this word that Hartman uses, a contamination. All of this history, all of this research we do can become a contamination on our being. And not only had I felt violated in some way, but I was also asking myself again, did I just replicate the very order of violence by folding the bodies of these women and girls into my useful and instructive research? into the work of my profession. My inner started to groan over whether or even how it was methodologically and ethically possible to do this work. Was my research about women's experiences of sexual violence also an act of voyeurism itself, some sick intellectual fantasy or a resurrection of violence? Whatever angle of self-reflection I took, I was troubled. And that impasse felt seemingly even more impossible after January 1st. But I find refuge in this line, or I attempt to find refuge in this line by Hartman. The necessity of trying to represent what we cannot, rather than leading to pessimism or despair, must be embraced as the impossibility that conditions our knowledge of the past and animates our desire for a liberated future. So Hartman, despite all of the trauma and pain and grief and heaviness and darkness that she often speaks about, there are results that are a symptom of doing work for her on histories of violence against Black women, for me on histories of violence within colonial projects, particularly in Cambodia. There is a sense of hope she still holds onto, and I try to as well, at least in this current moment. So here's my body laboring still with a delicate scar to the right of my L4, L5, reminding me to care over the alignment of my spine, which I'm now thinking about, the tilt of my pelvis, the curvature of my shoulders. About a month after my surgery, I heard that there was an energy healer from Hanoi who was visiting Phnom Penh. So of course, and of course poetically, she was a French woman, I was eager to try all methods of care in my rehabilitation. So I made an appointment to see her. And after the session, she advised me, I remember her saying this and it's searing into my brain. She advised me to dig my bare feet into a patch of dirt. And the first thing that came to my mind was like, where am I going to find dirt in Phnom Penh? But or grass. But while I knew nothing about chakras and still know close to nothing about them, I did not understand, and I did not understand the science or art of her practice. I took her words to heart. Researchers need to get out of their minds and get into the dirt. And so I will rest my researchers' typing fingers, get out of my researcher's sedentary pose, and plant my researcher's body into the earth. Thank you.
Audience over there, if you have any question, please drop your question in the Q&A box. I will read it to our speaker. And speaking on the Facebook page, you can also drop your question in the comment section, and then our team will pass it here so that I can ask our speaker. As of now, we have 3 questions. Can we proceed further? Proceed, Dr. Tara? Okay,
Sure.
cool. Okay, the first question is about the French protectorate. How did the French authority react to the rape cases? As our country still have tight political relationship, is the French recognizing the absurdity that our ancestors made? Are they trying to apologize somehow? Can you answer the question?
Right. Well, I can answer it, say in I'll answer it first in the context of like in that moment. And then also it sounds like the question is also curious about present contemporary French, I guess like opinions about this history. So in the context of that time, French authorities and just like French private residents were reacted as I think the same way we would today to a rape case, with outrage, with disgust, with judgment, right? And if you were a lawyer, a judge, someone who was trained in the law and had tendencies to believe that the law could fix these things, then how they reacted was they took those people to court. Those who were accused of the rape cases were taken to court and tried for crimes that had been laid out in not the Cambodian Indigenous Code, because there had been one developed, but in the new legal code, penal code developed by French authorities, the first version of that appearing in 1924. So they tried them according to those cases. However, it would be really, I have to nuance that answer by saying that there were different courses, there were different courts in Cambodia depending on who you were. And sometimes, depending on the crime, whether it was criminal or civil, like you could be charged in what was in a Cambodian court with a Cambodian judge, or you could be tried in a French court or European court. So sometimes there was this segregation of which laws apply to you and which court you would be tried in. Now, what are contemporary present French, sensibilities or like reactions to this today if they were to read this history? I think that's very mixed, and it depends. I think there are political differences and there are generational differences. When I was doing this workshop with students at the French high school in Phnom Penh, the Lycée Descartes, there were quite a few French students in that class with me. So these were, say, like 11th graders, somewhere between 9th to 11th grade. And most of them had come up to me saying, like, we never knew about this history. I mean, we knew, like, obviously we knew the French had colonized Cambodia, but we didn't know about these quote unquote, like, darker stories. It's not taught to us. So I think that it depends on the age, the education level, the generation. Some might be shocked and express disgust, and others might be say, yeah, well, there were bad things that happened in colonialism all over the world, but we can't deny some of the benefits that also came out of it. So there could be mixed responses to that. Thanks for that question.
Okay, the second question that we have here from Adam Clemens. What do you think is the way to mitigate, if not eliminate, researcher being negatively affected by their own body of research? Would you say that would be a necessary pain to go through or price to pay for the sake of accurate and deep research?
Right. No, that's a great question. Because there are those, passionate and hardcore among us who say, like, it's worth it. Like, this is research for many people, especially those who work on gender history, who work on history of empire, who are very concerned about and committed to questions of race, class, gender, inequality, discrimination, justice. Like, the research for them is activism. Like, it has a purpose. It has a moral calling. And for those who are able, like, it's worth every price, right? Because it's not just about publishing, and it's not just about contributing something to your field because someone hasn't done something on it yet. But for many, like, it's a moral calling. So I think that, like, that question is kind of, there's going to be a different answer to that depending on who you are, what your political and ethical commitments are, but also just like what your physical situation is. Like, for example, there's some people who just can't travel and go abroad and do archival research because they maybe physically aren't able to, maybe they don't have the finances to, maybe they just like can't because they have other commitments. They have to take care of their families or take care of other dependents. For others, they can't go to places because those archives just simply aren't within reach. Maybe they're in like a war zone, or maybe there's a lot of red tape and bureaucracy and you can't access it. One of my colleagues and friends in grad school, who was an Israeli citizen and was doing his research on Algeria, couldn't get into Algeria because of his passport. So, like, answering that question really depends on whatever particular set of limitations are on you, I think.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer, Dr. Tara. The other question we have here is mostly about clarification. Regarding the first part of the webinar, what the mentioned colonial Cambodian laws such as the prostitution ban or the legality of window opium selling present all over the French Indochina, or were they unique just to the Cambodian part of the colony? Opium selling for the window.
Right. No, thanks. This is a chance to talk about things a little bit more on a larger scale, regional scale, global, and comparatively. Um, many projects in Cambodia, particularly those related to these social assistance, these humanitarian interventions, were smaller versions of what was already going on in Vietnam. For example, prostitution. For example, maternal and infant protection. There were similar parallel societies, these private charities that were also already established in Vietnam. Um, the penal code applied to all of French Indochina. Perhaps the topic of chapter 1 on debt bondage was a little more unique to Cambodia because these practices of patronage and debt bondage, this particular relationship that this young enslaved woman had with this 𝐀𝐿 in Phnom Penh was unique to certain practices across Southeast Asia. So it could have also occurred in Vietnam. However, there could be some differences there. But in general, oftentimes, and those who argue for the uniqueness of Cambodia would not like me saying this, but oftentimes lots of the things happening in Cambodia were like these laboratories for what was already happening in elsewhere in Indochina, specifically Vietnam. And they were happening on smaller scales because there's just simply less people, less civil servants.
Like a prototype.
Yeah, sure. Again, I'm very cautious about saying that because there are those who argue for the specificity of place. Of course, it was not just it was just a copycat. And there's a different social, cultural, religious milieu happening in Cambodia compared to Vietnam. Vietnam is taking much more culturally from China. Cambodia, because of the different variants of Buddhism, is also responding differently. They have different sets of indigenous groups. The geography is different. It's more flat than Vietnam, which has the mountains. So lots of those variables will affect the implementation of those projects as well. So they're not just because you can't just plant one thing here and have it work out in another place. And the French discovered that too, even though French, as well as others like British, discovered you can't just take what's happening in Senegal and like do the same thing in Phnom Penh.
Okay, that question was from Peter David. We have another question here. It's from Elix Hondikova. What are the difference between conducting a court case in French versus a court case we say Cambodian for cases of rape and sexual violence?
Right. I think to answer this question, you have to, first of all, designate what the time period. So the penal code, the French penal code, becomes promulgated in Cambodia in 1924. Before then, there had been an operating, it was called, at least the French called it La Code Cambodgian. Like it was a set of codes that was developed by Andung, right before the colonial period and was written down. And then gradually piecemeal over time in the late 1800s and early 1900s, what the French attempted to do was reorganize the judiciary system, create the segregation. So change didn't happen like that in 1924, right? What I actually wanted to do to further develop what is the chapter? Chapter 3 on the Rape Chronicles is look at another parallel set of sources. So a lot of the court cases I was looking at, the sources for that chapter were either from French language newspapers or French court briefings. Interestingly, at the National Archives of Cambodia, what somebody really needs to do, myself or someone else, is look through all of the Cambodian language court summaries, which have it's a French language template. So it's all the same, but they're filled out in Khmer. The quality is quite terrible because just over time the paper has started to disintegrate and some of the writing has faded. But you can see that the Cambodian judges they're using different terms that are different from the French legal code. And I haven't figured out yet whether it's systematic or arbitrary. It would be interesting to see which codes they're citing to charge the accused, to see if there's some sort of systematic way, or to see if they have a different typology of sexual violence compared to the French penal code. Yeah, that someone really needs to look at that. Someone who has the patience to read all of those disintegrating documents.
Well, we got some word from Leslie Barnes. Tara, I don't have any question for you today. I just want to thank you for sharing your personal and research experience. I work on a similar question and share the ethical, methodological, and sometimes very embodied hesitation you have felt in researching violence against women in the Cambodian and Vietnamese context. And it has been very helpful for me to hear your reflection. It seemed like a compliment to you.
Thank you, Leslie. It would be great to talk further. There are many of us, I think, who need this therapy. At least this is what I found to be most helpful, particularly this year, on multiple levels.
We got another question from an anonymous attendee. It seems you have been deeply impacted by your work during the research process. What do you consider the most important reflection from this personal and academic experience? Additionally, what advice would you offer to fellow researchers who feel stuck or traumatized by their study? Thank you so much for your presentation, Doctor.
Okay, I think in answering this question, I'll also be condemning myself as a hypocrite, because I don't practice these things that I'm about to say myself. Just because again, like everybody is in a different situation. I understand everybody has different life circumstances and different accesses, abilities, privileges. But like the one thing that I would say is really important is like being able to take care of yourself. That sounds so simple and dumb and like just like way too simple. But yeah, like get up from your chair, go like this, move, talk to people about your work, like take a break and talk to people about your work. And I think this is particularly important for, okay, I haven't done research across all the different disciplines, but I think this is particularly important for historians, people who work in archives, but especially historians, because we tend to not publish together. We tend to do work on our pieces by ourselves versus I'm very envious of all my like natural scientist friends who like publish with their colleagues and they work on a project together. But historians, oftentimes you'll find us like in the archive, like just go like this, just like literally like this all day long with one box after another. It's 5 o'clock, we go, come back again the next day. Maybe there's some time to talk to each other, but because we've got to be productive, our time there is limited. Maybe we're like traveling from abroad, or maybe our visa is going to like expire. But again, like try to take care of yourself, but it's hard to do that because there's all of these, I think there's these like structural and institutional systems that make it difficult for us, like not being able to travel versus being able to travel, like having to be productive, especially when you're a grad student, like having to get the most out of your time. And one of my co-authors on this piece, where we talked about feminist problems in Cambodia, Cindy Nguyen, she writes this wonderful, actually, I'll try to share it with you guys somehow in some way, but she wrote a really wonderful blog piece on the value of slowness. Slow. And I think this just practicing slowness and on a literal level, but also just on an intellectual and mental level.
Thank you so much for your answer, Dr. Tara. Audience, if you have any question, we still have time. Please drop your question in the Q&A box, and then we will ask it to our speaker. We have a question from Petra Song from Highland Service. Thank you, Tara, for your honest interrogation of your work and also your personal experience. I am wondering what does you are finding in the New York City Central Park, and how deeply you are about to immerse yourself in it. Will it take you away from talking further to us?
Thank you, Helen. So just a really brief clarification. So I'm at the University of New York in Prague, so not New York, but they have their dual degree relationship with the University of New York. But yeah, no, thanks for bringing this up. Again, like I'm gonna I'm going to condemn myself as a hypocrite here, guilty of not taking my own advice. There's definitely way more dirt and parks here, so that's good. So the opportunities are ripe for me to take care of myself and dig my toes into the dirt. The summer was particularly useful, I guess, in this when we moved back here to like be slow. And I think that just on a personal note, we didn't have the regular childcare that we used to have in Phnom Penh. So I was with my daughter for most days. And let me tell you, like being a parent really, I mean, not only like forces you to become fast, but it forces you to be slow, involuntarily, like against my will. Sometimes I was just like, let's just get this done. But like I was just forced to be slow. I just like to sit in the sand pit with her and get sand in my shoes and all over my body and everywhere and just be there with her because like we had nowhere else to be and that's where she wanted to be. I don't know. So I guess she helped me listen to my own advice and she is a reminder for me to be slow against my own will at times.
I have two more questions before we take other questions from our audience. The first one, what interest or use could someone outside of Cambodia study or Southeast Asia study take in your research? I will go with the second question. What are ways that institutions like university, library, and archive or donor can do to help researchers in their physical, mental, and emotional well-being?
I'll note those questions soon, but may I answer this other question first that popped up?
We have another question from Hunter. I appreciate your kindness. Research, it seems like an emotional to me. My question is challenging of your research data with its language. Thanks for your sharing.
My question is how challenging of your research data with its languages. Languages, I'm gonna read this as you mean the language of the sources. So the primary language of these sources, since it's from the French colonial period, and a lot of it is from the National Archive, so that means they were officially state-produced documents, was French. It was, how challenging is it? I think it really depends on the source, because, for example, there are certain sources that are quite bland and straightforward. It's like a memo and it just reports something. Is not something very interesting to analyze deeply, I suppose. But I found the most interesting sources were the journalism sources or newspaper accountings because they become a little bit more literary. But yeah, language is definitely, this isn't, I guess, like a advice to anyone interested in pursuing graduate research or doing in languages that are not their own native language, is that, yeah, that presents another, let's call it hurdle or barrier to the research. For some, it's an art form and it's really interesting because I did have to, I couldn't just literally translate, for example, Allah, even though you would think Allah is something really interesting to translate. But sometimes there are certain like subtleties in the way something is phrased that has to be translated. I can't tell you how many times I was frustrated by the letters of French bureaucrats because there's this thing where like they just won't get to the point until the very last paragraph. And I'm just like, oh my God, what are you saying here? So that's a time issue again.
I think we have another question from Patrick Lazaro. In your opinion, what are the current day legacy of French colonial discourses on Khmer women?
I know that there are colonial legacies on Khmer people in general. In what way have they shaped perceptions of Khmer women? Okay, well, I don't know if these are particularly French, but more so just generally European colonial representations of Asian women being, I think these are all like associations and terms I think many of us have heard as like gentle, quiet, passive, particularly, it's interesting also to when they compare ethnic Khmer women to say ethnic Vietnamese women, and they'll say, oh, the Vietnamese women are like can be louder, it can be more aggressive, can be more like, that like market woman. And those types of that type of gendering and ethnic identification is occurring as early as the 1800s when the French begin to arrive. Oftentimes, if you look at the accounts of, say, French anthropologists, social scientists who are doing their ethnographies, or if you look at just the accounts of French civil servants, like this doctor in a province who's filling out his monthly report, you pick up on the way they characterize Khmer women. For example, when it comes to Khmer mothers, as they're weak, they're small, they're frail, they're not able to have these babies. This is why these babies are dying. They're not eating well. They don't know how to take care of them. They're not educated enough. Really, as people who need to be helped, weak creatures who need to be helped. On the other hand, then when you look at, for example, representations of the prostitutes, then they're seen as people who are aggressive, who are sexually promiscuous, who have a very, very different profile. And I think you could say that some of those representations, pieces of them, still surface in contemporary associations.
Big question. I think that is all from our participant. I think you can start answering the last two questions that I asked.
Right. What can people outside of Cambodia and Southeast Asian studies take away from this, hopefully? I care a little bit about this question because as someone who, like anyone else who works on Cambodia studies, they understand how small niche of an area this is. Let's face it, there's a lot of people in the world that doesn't even know Cambodia as a country. So why should they care, right? I tried to do my research and teaching so that it can be relevant to people outside of Cambodia studies. And the way that I attempt to do that is by focusing on questions more of a universal nature or themes that can be relatable or approachable from other contexts. And for me, at least this over the last 10 years, that theme has been about hospitality. And I hope that those questions at least would make someone interested or allow them to take away something from my research and teaching, not only from different disciplines within academia, but also from people outside of academia, particularly practitioners, particularly activists. So anyway, I try to make my work as publicly approachable as possible. The second question was, can you remind me again? What was that? Something about, what?
Simply mean, how can we help you? What are the ways that institutions like university, library, and archive or donor could help researchers in their physical, mental, and emotional well-being? How can we help you, Dr. Tara?
I'm going to speak mostly for grad students because I know there's such a huge population, not only US, but elsewhere, but just their particular lifestyle. Because this is that formative period when they're making the decision that I'm going to be an academic, I'm going to be a researcher. A better pay, better benefits that allow them to take care of themselves, that allow them to take time off, that allow them to spend money on things like therapy or, and also more of a challenge to this mandate of productivity. By the time of by a couple of years into grad school, I became so sick of hearing the word productive. I was so productive today. I wasn't very productive today. And that was just it was either a source of pride or shame. And it was the thing that energized us and kept us going on. Whether that was but I think maybe in some senses to a positive degree, but in many other senses to a negative degree. Yeah, just breaking down this the idolization of productivity.
We have one question from anonymous attendee. Thank Dr. Tara. I'm doing a research on leadership in higher education in post-colonial Cambodia, adapting post-colonial theory. I found the presentation is useful for me. Would you recommend material related to colonial administration and related to education, published in English?
This is a great question, and I'm going to point you right away to a friend of mine who also did her work. Oh, shoot. Did I answer the question? Yeah, I did.
Yes.
To a
I'm
friend of
sure.
mine, also works in Cambodia and who has also worked in the National Archives in Cambodia, Katrina Miller. She did her doctoral research on the late colonial, post-colonial period in Cambodia, specifically on, and there's a big part of it that has to do with education, specifically women's education, and she looks at this like national and state schooling system. So I would definitely reach out to her or look into her doctoral thesis, which I think should be available soon because she finished just a little bit before I did. She looks interestingly at the role that a lot of Khmer women played on a national level in shaping the national conversation about schools and especially schools for girls education.
that's cool. I think that is all for today. If we do not have any other question, Dr. Tara, do you have any other insight or recommendation you want to share with our audience today?
Nothing except I hope everybody gets up and stretches after this.
Thank you so much.
That'll be my advice for you.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for participating
Bye.
in the online webinar titled Body of Research and Researcher Body, Methodological and Ethical Trouble from Cambodia, present to you by Dr. Tara Tran. Thank you so much for your time.